Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'm recording this podcast from a very rustic location on the island of Zakinthos, so if you hear chickens in the background, you will have a pretty good idea why. Now, I finished the last podcast saying that I was going to have a break unless something really important happened, and indeed, it did. Just after I left, the United States announced that they were going to have a review into AUKUS. That's something that attracted quite a lot of attention, and I'll come to that in a moment. After the previous podcast, which was mainly about C3000, I was contacted by ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems about part of my analysis, where I pointed out that it would have been possible for all three of the first ships to be built in Australia rather than in Germany. But TKMS have pointed out that under the existing timetable announced by Defence and the government, the only way that the dates can be met is to build all three ships in Germany. There just isn't enough time now to migrate the build program to Australia to allow that to happen. And I might not have been sufficiently clear about that, so let me just restate that when the Defence Strategic Review was concluded in April in 2023, that led to a separate surface fleet review, which I've been very critical of. But anyway, if a decision had been taken at around that time to do all of the ships in Australia, I believe that companies such as ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems would have had sufficient lead time to do the work to allow that to happen. That didn't happen, and I think the reason is obvious, because defence decision-making has become so haphazard and so personal that I assume somebody very senior must have said, this is again in mid-2023, that the first three have to be built offshore, we can't do it in Australia, and that has just been parroted again and again, and it was just accepted as conventional wisdom. Anyway, that's what seems to pass for an analysis these days by Defence. Now, we'll return to this topic a bit later, that's C3000, to discuss what on earth is going on with Western Australia, the Henderson Shipbuilding Precinct, and the presumed role of Austal. They still haven't signed the strategic agreement with Defence. No one quite knows why. No one knows why Defence have selected Austal. Now, it's also clear from media reporting that one of the key programs in all of this, landing craft medium, appears to be falling apart. And why all of this is happening and why Austal's share price is continuing to go through the roof might at some stage be getting close to a reference to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Again, I'll have more to say on that in future. But again, the main reason why I'm squeezing in the extra podcast is the Trump administration reviewing AUKUS, and rather ominously, I feel, reviewing it to see if it fits the America First agenda. So let's be clear, it's not some sort of broad review, but something very specifically about the way that the Trump administration views the rest of the world. And before we get into the details, why, once again, do we have to find this out from the Americans? Defence Minister Richard Marles said that he was made aware of the review weeks ago. So why didn't he say something? Similarly, after meeting with US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth in Singapore, he, Marles, said vaguely that there was talk about Australia needing to lift defence spending, only for the Americans to issue a media release saying that the amount should be 3.5% of GDP. Again, why didn't our Defence Minister say that? There are deliberate lies and lies by omission, and this is another case just of not coming out and telling the truth. And I find that a lot of AUKUS is treated in much the same way. It started with a lengthy process of official deception about the amount of money that Australia is handing over to US industry, a gift, with ministers, including Marles and Conroy, and senior defence bureaucrats, saying that the sum was $3 billion over and over again. And a few of us started digging into this, and I had a small role, I might say, in finding out that it's $3 billion US dollars, which on today's exchange rate is about 5 billion Australian, a significant difference. And I'm actually surprised that that matter received so little attention at the time. It was a clear case of politicians and defence officials minimising the gift to the US by about $2 billion, a not insignificant amount. But since we're discussing Minister Marles and deception, there's clearly been another one over this US review, and in the background, the UK also decided a few weeks ago that they were going to review AUKUS. So of the three countries involved, US is having a review, UK is having a review, but not Australia. Now, Minister Marles was asked if we should have one, and his answer was, oh, well, we already have had, in the form of the aforementioned Defence Strategic Review. I don't like using the word lie. It's a very ugly one. So let me say, no, Minister, what you have just said there is completely untrue. The DSR was officially precluded from examining AUKUS, and it's very hard to believe that you have forgotten that point. You were the minister responsible. Not only did the DSR not look into AUKUS, there was then the separate shipbuilding review that I've been extremely critical of, that was just riddled with factual errors. And I'll again remind people that the justification for that separate review into the surface fleet was that the addition of nuclear-powered submarines to the Australian inventory was going to possibly alter the equation when it came to anti-submarine warfare, because submarines themselves are powerful anti-submarine warfare assets. So that was the justification for the extra, goodness knows how many millions of dollars in consulting fees were involved. But when that review was published, that matter was not canvassed at all. It didn't even get a mention. So back to today. It's far more likely that Minister Marles just doesn't want a review of AUKUS that will further expose areas of stupidity, such as the total of 10 billion of gifts to the US and the UK, 10 billion transfers to shipbuilding companies in both of those countries with no refund clause. And honestly, what sort of stupidity is this? Because without refund clauses, Australia has no leverage over either Washington or London. They don't have to return a cent to us if, for whatever reason, the program gets cancelled. But since it's Pick on Richard Marles Day, and I make the normal disclaimer, he's a very nice person. None of this is personal. I just happen to profoundly disagree with many aspects of his management of defence. Although I will say, a little bit cattily, all journalists are not impressed with his ridiculous ego-driven insistence that he be called the Deputy Prime Minister. When we get media releases, they come out in heavy, black, all-caps type DPM media. And the thing is, none of we journalists are in the slightest bit interested in hearing his views as the Deputy Prime Minister. We want to hear his views as the Defence Minister of Australia, because that's the only thing that actually counts. He has said on several occasions, subsequent to the US announcement, that Australia doesn't need a Plan B, because we can't keep chopping and changing, and we have to simply make Plan A work. Now, when I hear this, I wonder if he is able to dress unaided, because he clearly doesn't understand what a Plan B is. It doesn't mean you stop working on Plan A. It does mean when you are starting to have reservations about Plan A, and that should have been the case for AUKUS from the very beginning, you work in parallel on an alternate solution so that if Plan A eventually fails, you have a fallback position. At the moment, Australia has nothing. In this case, a Plan B might be, for example, buying nuclear-powered submarines from France. Or it could be building conventional diesel-electric submarines, very importantly with air-independent propulsion, building them in Australia, designed by Germany or South Korea or Japan. As I mentioned in the previous podcast, ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems cannot keep up with the demand for conventional submarines, which for me has always raised the obvious question, if nuclear submarines are supposedly so superior, why are lots of countries investing in diesel-electric technology? In our region, as I think I've said before, those nations are South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now, another Plan B, and one which I am increasingly in favour of, is to invest a lot more money in undersea drone technology. All of these things are some sort of viable alternatives to nuclear-powered submarines if the US review puts an end to all of this. And it is so frustrating that the current government and the current crop of ministers are simply not prepared to face up to reality, to accept that it's a possibility that we will need to look at something else. So let's spend a few minutes thinking about what the US might do. And the review is underway. We will know in about 4 weeks what the outcome is. And there are only 3, I guess, really broad possibilities. The review might conclude that, yeah, AUKUS Pillar 1, it's all sweet. We'll just go ahead with things as planned. That's one. The second, at the other end of the register, could conclude, no, this is definitely not in the interests of the United States. We cannot build submarines fast enough. And even if we could, it doesn't make sense for us to transfer these assets to or sell them to someone else, such as Australia. But there's a third possibility, and if I had to make a guess, that's my favoured one, because it might come up with some sort of pathway forward, but that it will take more time and it will drain Australia of more cash. Now, if I look at this cynically from the United States viewpoint, they are getting a lot out of this deal. The aforementioned $5 billion, Australian dollars, that's not insignificant, but also bundled up in it, there are a lot of Australian sailors who are serving on board US nuclear-powered submarines. There are Australian workers who are learning a little bit, I don't know how much, but they're learning about maintenance procedures on US nuclear-powered submarines. Now, if you were to look at this cynically from the eyes of the Trump administration, you'd think, well, this is actually pretty good. We're getting all of this stuff from Australia, and for the moment, we don't really have to give them anything in return. Yeah, we've got this vague commitment that around 2032, we're going to sell them a couple of second-hand nuclear-powered submarines, but why not just string that out indefinitely? We've got the, again, so-called rotational force of 4 Virginia-class submarines being based at HMAS Sterling from 2027. That's clearly in the US interest. It makes targeting equations for Chinese planners a little bit more complex because you have to factor in submarines not only in Guam and Hawaii and places like that, but now also HMAS Sterling as part of the mix. You know, that's a good thing from the US perspective. You've got all of this other related activity underway. So why would you willingly bring that to an abrupt halt? Would you not, from the US perspective, be better off concluding a review with something like, The Trump administration remains in favour, generally, of this, but the first submarines for Australia will not be available in 2032. It's more likely to be 2035 or 2036. This is also proving to be more expensive than we anticipated, and so we will be asking Australia for a further contribution of $5 billion spread out across the 2030s. Now, I think I've mentioned this sort of possibility before because, for me, it really is, for Australia, the worst of all of the scenarios, because there is no off-ramp for us. Or let me put it this way. Our senior defence officials and the current crop of ministers haven't bothered figuring out what the off-ramp might look like. So they, I assume, would just be happy to keep on muddling along, to accept the US view that this is going to take a few more years, and yes, we've got to give them even more money. The coalition presumably would sign up to that as well. The net result of that will be it costs Australian taxpayers even more. We still don't get any submarines at the end of the day, and it further draws out the point, the date at which Australia has to finally accept reality and say, my goodness, this just isn't going to work. We just have to do something else. That's a rather pessimistic way of looking at things, but unfortunately, as I say, I regard that as the most likely of the scenarios. Okay, we're running out of time. Goodbye from Zakinthos, and I'll speak again, hopefully in about a fortnight's time. Thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.